And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Consortium News has a piece entitled "The Petrodollar's Long Goodbye," where Vijay Prashad writes, as part of their concern about currency power, many countries in the global south are eager to develop non-dollar trade and investment systems. As a complement to this, thecradle.com has a piece entitled "Xi of Arabia and the Petroyuan Drive." Xi Jinping has made an offer difficult for the Arabian Peninsula to ignore. China will be guaranteed buyers of your oil and gas, but we will pay in yuan. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled "The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism." Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this piece continues. It would be so tempting to qualify Chinese President Xi Jinping landing in Riyadh a week ago, welcomed with royal pomp and circumstance, as Xi of Arabia, proclaiming the dawn of the Petro-Yuan era. But it's more complicated than that. As much as the seismic shift implied by the Petro-Yuan move applies, Chinese diplomacy is way too sophisticated to engage in direct confrontation, especially with a wounded, ferocious empire. So there's way more going on here than meets the Eurasian eye. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, first of all, consult the Global Times, the Chinese periodical. If you look at it recently, you will see a very revealing article about a recent visit to China by representatives of the Biden administration, including the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs. And they were supposedly preparing a visit to China of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, which had been requested and suggested by Mr. Biden during his Bali meeting with President Xi. But the meeting did not go very well, and I think it bespeaks the sharp decline in relations between Washington and Beijing. It's reflected in the fact that U.S. sell treasury bills to China, to the People's Bank of China. These treasury bills are useful for subsidizing and supporting everything from the post office to the Pentagon. They've been going down and have reached a 12-year low. This suggests that this may help to push the United States further into crisis, because at the same time, you see the United States continuing to ship billions to this sinkhole in Ukraine. You see that the Pentagon is being granted record sums. And at the same time, Mr. Biden is seeking to adhere to a campaign pledge that he will not raise taxes over a certain amount. Now, something has to give. And I should also mention and reinforce the point that you just made, which is that the trip to Saudi Arabia of President Xi also bespeaks the impending decline of the so-called petrodollar, which had provided an enormous imperial stake to Washington, since countries who were seeking to purchase the lifeblood of their economy, speaking of petroleum, found it necessary to go to the U.S. printing press in order to get greenbacks. If that system no longer obtains, it'll be a mighty blow, a further blow to U.S. imperialism. And that is the kind of blow that I'm afraid the U.S. imperialism cannot withstand for long.
Quickly, what do you think about post the Africa summit here in Washington, D.C., what you picked up? You know, I mean, I think it's all part of the same conversation, but what you got out of that, a summit?
Well, disgruntlement on the part of African nations who, despite Mr. Biden's protestations to the contrary, were having their arms twisted in terms of entering into the U.S. camp vis-a-vis the ongoing confrontation with Russia and China. Likewise, many of the African nations were not pleased with the fact that the head of state, President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, was rudely not invited to this summit. African nations, like a good deal of progressive humanity, see the sanctions against Zimbabwe imposed by Washington in the wake of Zimbabwe's land reform, an attempt to administer a stinging blow to settler colonialism, in that you had British invaders coming into that Southern African nation in the late 19th century and basically taking over and saying that now they're in charge. And after the independent government sought to push back against that, Washington, perhaps seeing a potential blow being reinforced at its own system of settler colonialism and dispossession of the indigenous of North America, decided to punish Zimbabwe, which was also simultaneously a message to South Africa and Namibia, who also have longstanding claims with regard to land being seized from European invaders. So that is what I gleaned from this summit, which overall, even from Washington's point of view, was deemed to be a disappointment.
I was trying to figure out from the time that they talked about this thing being launched, what it was they were trying to accomplish. How could they, what would they use to define success? Other than the dog and pony show, I really couldn't figure out, particularly when you listen to the tenor and tone of the rhetoric, whether it was from Linda Thomas Greenfield at the UN or whether it was from Tony Blinken. I couldn't figure out what the win was here in the minds of the United States, other than getting those folks to come to Washington. Dr. Horne.
It was a photo op. Coming out of this meeting was a very nice photo of Mr. Biden surrounded by African leaders. Perhaps the Biden administration feels they can parlay that on the campaign trail, that they can somehow throw dust in the eyes of the unwary voter, particularly voters of African descent, and convince them that somehow Mr. Biden is doing something for the motherland. But for those not in that naive category, it's difficult to glean what was the point of this summit, particularly if you compare the rather paltry sums being pledged, which probably won't be met in any case, with the gargantuan sums coming out of the People's Republic of China. So apparently, Washington is taking African leaders for fools, and I don't think that they are, and I think Washington will be disappointed as a result.
Another article in the Greenville Post, Ukraine crisis, a catalyst for the burial of American hegemony, and they make a pretty good argument. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly this Ukrainian crisis is blowing up in Washington's face. You may have paid attention to the recent revelation by former Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, who suggested that a lot of the negotiations with Russia, more particularly the so-called Minsk II agreement, were actually just a ruse to buy time for Ukraine and the Kiev regime to further arm. And you see that reflected today with the recent revelation, the recent news that Washington is sending the so-called Patriot system to Ukraine, which supposedly will help to knock down these missiles that are being rained down on Ukraine from Russia just about every day now. But even those who are sympathetic to Kiev recognize that the Patriot system is not a game changer, that it will not help to change the facts on the ground. And at the same time, the Ukraine crisis is leading to a fraying of relations between the United States and its European allies. We've talked many times on this program about how Chancellor Scholz of Berlin traveled to Beijing, and we know that that recent visit was a slap in the face of Washington, because China is the ultimate target of this escapade in Ukraine, that is to say, to knock down Russia a peg or two in order to weaken China's major ally. and then with that momentum going after China. But this particular strategy is spinning out of control. Let me point to you the recent op-ed in the New York Times by former Trump trade negotiator Robert Lighthizer, where he suggests that the trade war against China should be escalated, that in fact tariffs should be placed on Chinese goods coming into the United States, which would basically be a blow to the U.S. workers' incomes, and so many of our goods come from the People's Republic of China, not to mention the fact that the slowdown in trade between China and the United States is already having knock-on effects in terms of the all-important Los Angeles Long Beach port, which is no longer the major port in the United States of America, believe it or not. That championship role has now switched to New York, New Jersey. And that also bespeaks this other point, which is the United States is trying to shift trade relations from the Pacific to the Atlantic. But I see that as a move of desperation that will likely end in tears.
What do you think about this piece in the context of it first ran in April, shortly after the intervention in Ukraine began? And the first paragraph, the U.S., the culprit of the Ukraine crisis, has long created crises and taken advantage of others' misfortune to maintain its hegemony. It hopes to use the crisis, which has lasted for over a month, to drag Russia down, reap economic and political benefits, and prevent Europe from pursuing strategic autonomy so as to consolidate the U.S. hegemony. They wrote this back in April, and here we are now. And it seems like this piece was much more prophetic than many would have given credit to when it was written.
Well, it's not only that, but we now can hook up the two stories. We know now that part of the rationale for this so-called Africa Summit was to lock in African energy supplies, Nigerian petroleum, Angolan petroleum, Algerian natural gas, Nigerian natural gas, because of the boycott of Russian energy. But African leaders know that is the strategy, and they do not want to be used and manipulated by Uncle Sam, and that gives them more bargaining and more leveraging power, and that also helps to explain why Mr. Biden was throwing out concessions at a mile a minute, suggesting that there be a permanent seat for the African Union at the G20 summits upcoming, the last one in Bali, as you know, and also guaranteeing a seat at the top table at the United Nations Security Council, the permanent members for Africa. Africa wants 2 seats, so they have to negotiate that.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio.